He's going to be talking to us today, I guess, about his military service. He's a former Marine. He was in Vietnam vet. And,
That's correct.
And then you were also written a book. So.
Written 2 books. Just one minor correction. No such thing as a former Marine.
No.
I was once a Marine. I am today a Marine. And I'll always be a Marine. First of all, Tony, thank you very much for this kind invitation to come here and talk about my books and my experience in Vietnam. Before we get started, Presentation 101 says, know your audience. And I would like to ask all of you here today who are veterans of any era to please stand and be recognized. Do we have any veterans with us? Thank you very much for your service to our country. Please remain standing. Those of you who served in World War II in Korea, again known as the greatest generation, and if you look at the facts on the ground, you can't really argue that fact. But I'd like you to sit, and I ask my fellow Vietnam veterans to remain standing for just a moment. Great. It's great to have you guys here. There's an author by the name of Jim Webb who wrote an op-ed who compares our generation favorably with the greatest generation. If you look at the circumstances and so forth, I happen to agree with his assessment. But I just want to say to you, thanks for your service and welcome home. Thank you. I'm not going to give you too much information about what's in my books. After all, I brought some. I'd be happy to sell them to you and sign them for you. But I will talk a little bit about the first book, which is called Phase Line Green, The Battle for Hue, 1968. This was published by Naval Institute Press in 1997. It only took me 14 years to write it and to revise it and revise it and revise it to the point where I got the final manuscript approved. And there was a little help from my friends. As a matter of fact, one of my neighbors here in California, as I was getting close to publication, who is a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel and an author of 2 really great books, became a friend. He read my manuscript, he helped me revise it, and he actually called up and threatened the acquisitions editor at Naval Institute Press that if he didn't read my manuscript, he'd kick his ass. Okay, so I have to thank Alex Lee for that. This book has several different lives, and I'll tell you a little bit about those. The second book, Charlie 1-5, Marine Company's Vietnam War, came about as a result of this book being published, because this helped create a veterans organization, and we began having reunions. And I met and learned to love a lot of guys who were in Vietnam before me, and a lot who were there after me. So this is a prequel. This covers the first 2 years of the war. It's just been out in hardcover so far. But it includes the stories and the histories of about 30 combat veterans that served in my battalion. One of the cool things about this book, but it's one of the reasons why it's expensive, is that it has color operational maps. There's 8 different maps in here that are rendered in color. So those are my books. I am going to talk to you a little bit about a little thing called the Battle for Hue City during the Tet Offensive of 1968, which is what this book is all about. I'm also going to show you some images. And there's a short video clip that will help you understand the nature of the Battle for Hue City. Leading up to Tet in 1968, which occurred, the Tet Offensive was launched on the 31st of January 1968. We had been fighting in the rice paddies, in the villages, in the jungles, in the mountains, and we had developed a certain type of warfare for that terrain and for those enemy It was largely hit and run, hit and run, hit and run, drawing us into a position where a large NVA unit would then stand and fight. And those battles would go on for several days. This was completely different. All of a sudden, we found ourselves fighting in people's houses. And it wasn't just the fact that we were fighting in people's houses. It was we were in a city that to the Vietnamese people would be like combining the cities of Boston, New York City, and Washington, D.C. So imagine that an enemy force had attacked America and had seized Washington, D.C., New York City, and Boston. We have a lot of buildings there that are sacred to us. The Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and so forth and so on, the Capitol building. That's what this city, the city of Warr, represents to the Vietnamese people. Before I get too far on this, I want to tell you that there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and I happen to personally believe that that's the most important part of these presentations. And in order to encourage you to ask a question or two, I have brought a really fine writing instrument, which is also a flashlight, by the way. It's pretty cool. And whoever asks the best question will get one of these pens. So keep track of what's going on here. But first, I have a couple questions for you, for you to chew on and consider as I'm going through the presentation. Here's the first question. Why is the history of the Vietnam War, and especially the outcome of the war, even important today? I mean, after all, this battle took place 51 years ago. So what's the big deal, right? Just think about that. The second question is one that I've pondered and thought about during all those 50 years is, how is it even possible that the nation who won every significant battle in that war lost the war? How is it even possible? I have my own answers to those questions, and if you're interested in when we get to the Q&A, I'll be happy to give you my answers. I arrived in the Republic of Vietnam, that's the country we knew as South Vietnam, on the 15th of November 1967. At that point, I had been in Marine Corps training since June of 1966. I went to boot camp, I went to infantry training, I had 4 months off, and then I was assigned as part of the enlisted commissioning program to attend the officer candidate school, which was a 10-week experience, at which time I was considered an officer and a gentleman by Congress, and then I went to the basic school, which was 21 weeks of additional training to teach me how to be a Marine Corps officer. I also went to 6 weeks of high-intensity immersion Vietnamese language training, and then I found myself in the Republic of Vietnam. The first thing that happened was on the way over, I read a newspaper, the Army-Navy Times, and in it was the casualty reports for the previous week. 4 of my classmates were already dead, and 2 of them were high achievers. And I began to wonder, am I prepared? So when I was assigned to be the platoon commander for the 1st platoon of a company they referred to as Suicide Charlie, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, I began to doubt myself. So through the luck of the draw, my platoon sergeant, the guy who had been running as the acting platoon commander, my platoon for 2 months, took me under his arm, told me, hey, forget you're in charge, Lieutenant. We're going to teach you how to do this. And he sent me out on small unit patrols and night ambush patrols. He said, hide your brown bars. One of the things that I knew at that point is in military tactics and strategies, a Marine second lieutenant, a butter bar, was considered, who had a compass and a weapon, was considered one of the most dangerous creatures on the battlefield. Because sometimes they're stupid and they don't listen. I listened to them. Smartest thing I ever did. So For the next 2.5 months, we fought in the rice paddies, and in the jungles, and in the mountains, and in the small villages in the Republic of Vietnam against a very elusive Viet Cong, and from time to time we would then run into larger units and have major battles. One of the things that Mother told me many years later, by the way, we called him Mother. Some of them called him Mother, depending on the circumstances. When we reunited, he looked at me and said, you know, Lieutenant, he said, when you first arrived in country, I didn't know whether to salute you and pat you on the ass. I guess I was pretty young looking. Okay. And I was 22 years old. On the 31st of January 1968, Tet broke out. For the first time in this entire war, the North Vietnamese army came out of the jungles and the mountains in force and attacked over 100 cities up and down South Vietnam. Those of you who were around then, you probably remember all of the film and the reporting and so forth. Casualties were through the roof. And we were surprised initially. So this was now, it completely changed everything. One of those cities is the historic city of Warr, which meant an awful lot to the Vietnamese people. And the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong had taken over 90% of that city. And they were there in force and they were there to stay. This is what the city of Warr looks like, kind of an aerial view. It is a massive fortress. Those outside walls are 30 feet high and 90 feet thick. There's only 10 ways in and out. And 9 of the 10 ways, the 4 gates on the south wall, and there was only 1 gate that was still under friendly hands. Fortunately for us, first time 5th Marines, we were able to sneak in the back door, so we didn't have to somehow assault those walls. The ARVN soldiers, the 1st ARVN Division, had managed to hold out, as there were 2 weeks of fighting on the south side of the river. This is a map of the Citadel Fortress. You see down in the south side what they call the New City. There was about 2 weeks of heavy combat, heavy urban fighting on the south side of the river before we even got there. Initially, our mission was to attack and destroy the enemy forces holding Warr and holding the Citadel, but we were under strict orders that we were not to damage any of the buildings. And if you consider for a moment how the Marine Corps does, how it works, we're a Marine Air-Ground Task Force. Yes, we have young Marines who do the shooting, but typically you're using bombardment, artillery, naval gunfire, and airstrikes to soften up the enemy targets, at which time you then send in the Marines. We were under strict orders. We could not use any heavy weapons. Those rules of engagement on the south side of the river lasted for 6 days. And they were continuing, and our sister battalion who were there at that point had lost about 40%. Either killed or wounded and medevac, with barely any progress. There's a place here on the south side of the river, it's number 5. That's the MACV compound, Military Advisory Command Vietnam, which was about a 200-man stronghold. They held out, and on the 6th day, a Vietnamese man in civilian clothes approached the MACV compound with a stick and a white flag. Fortunately for all of us, they didn't shoot him, because there had been incidents where NVA soldiers would put on civilian clothes, wave a white flag, Marines then expose themselves and get killed. They didn't kill him, didn't shoot him. They brought him inside the compound, and he introduced himself as an ARVN colonel who had been home on Tet when the NV overwhelmed the city. And they took over his house, and his house was the command post, the enemy command post. So he said, give me a map, I'll show you right where the head of the snake is. And all you gotta do is destroy my house. They said, oh, well, we're sorry, we can't do that, we're under orders, we can't. And he said, give me a radio. So he got the radio and he called the commanding general, who's up in the right-hand corner. And an hour later, artillery bombardment destroyed that man's house, which allowed for the Marines in the south side of the river to begin to make progress. Rules of engagement were now normalized. They were in balance with the Marines' ability to do their job. Strangely enough, when we arrived inside the Citadel on the afternoon of the 12th of February, our rules of engagement were reestablished as your job is to destroy the enemy inside the Citadel, but you can't damage any of the buildings. For 3 days, we conducted suicide frontal assaults, and we failed every time. On the morning of the first day, my platoon, through a series of kind of chances, were the point attack element. My 51 Marines were facing 5,000 NV soldiers who were completely took over that Citadel. But if you see the green line there, number 13, that's called phase line green. That's where the title of my book came from. That day, we were ordered to assault without the use of supporting arms. My platoon did not survive that day intact. So that gives you an idea of what we were facing. So here's what our mission was: attack and destroy, but you can't destroy any of the buildings. Couldn't use any of the tools we had been using for 2.5 years and how we had been trained to fight. And we were limited to our small arms weapons, our machine guns, and the biggest explosive device we had was the M79 40mm grenade launcher, the blueprint, right? That actually worked pretty good, but it wasn't anything like what we had been trained to do. This is what, this picture was taken in 1998 from the flag tower east along the outside wall of the Citadel Fortress. So you can see it's very thick, it's very tall, and it's very substantial. There's no way, using conventional weapons, that you can blow a hole through that wall because it's 90 feet thick. You can sit there with tanks and recoilless rifles for days and days and really not even dent that thing. This is what the Imperial Palace's, the Heavenly Gate looks like. So this is what it looks like today. And this little film clip will give you an idea of the abrupt change in the nature of this war during the Battle for Way City. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
Way was considered one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. Divided by the Perfume River, Way was virtually two cities. One modern with wide avenues and 2- and 3-story European-style buildings. And north of the river, an ancient city known as the Citadel, or Fortress, surrounded by thick walls and modeled after the imperial city in Beijing.
Anybody notice what he's carrying? That's an enemy AK-47, that's a Marine shooting it. You adapt, you improvise, you grab something that works. So we had gone from this hit and run, advance and pursue in a very, very beautiful country. And One of the challenges of that is that the hit and run would often mean you wouldn't see anybody for 4, 5, 6 days, maybe even 2 weeks. And the countryside's beautiful, so you get somewhat distracted, then all of a sudden, they hit you hard, and they run. And they were actually quite good at it because they would hit you hard, and they would run towards a larger unit in a good position to take you into a firefight. To all of a sudden, the cameras all turned black and white, and it was ugly. There is no style of warfare at all, even today, that would spare a city like this, or any city, of becoming rebelized. This is a photo taken of a Delta company. They called it Dying Delta. It seemed like they just seemed to run into the wrong places at the wrong time. On the rubble that was the Dongba Tower. This is what phase line green looks like about 2 days after the end of the battle. The photographer is standing on that tower. You're going to see a picture of that in a minute. And this was the street that my platoon and company had to cross. It was 24 yards across, no cover whatsoever. There's no way to go around, try to do a flank. You simply had to suck it up and go and pray. And I have to tell you that one of the reasons I remember my guys so much, and I love to see them every year at reunions, is every single time I said attack, they knew this was crazy. They weren't stupid. They rose up and attacked. Excuse me. This is what it looks like today. This is what it looked like when it was first built. So we're looking from the outside. That is the Dongba Tower. Thanks to UNESCO, who donated millions and millions of dollars to the Vietnamese people after the war. They've completely renovated this entire amazing place. And it makes me happy to see it. And now, I love this photo because it was taken about 60 pounds ago. That's me on the left, and that's my good friend Scott Nelson, who as a first lieutenant was the company commander of Charlie Company during the battle for Way. One of the best natural leaders I've ever known. So I want to talk a little bit about aftermath and outcomes, and then we'll open this up to questions. One of the first things that happened when my book was published is I reunited with Mother Mullen. I haven't told you that story, but after saving 3 of our guys, he was hit in the head by an enemy sniper, and we all thought he was dead. Excuse me. But he survived, thanks to our corpsman and the entire medical. They got him out to the sanctuary. They did immediate surgery on him. Then he was 12 months in Philadelphia Naval Hospital with traumatic brain injury, but he survived and went on to have 2 other careers. Marine Corps kicked him out because he was disabled. Worst day of his life. When I met with Mother in late 1998, he said, "Hey, Lieutenant, you're coming with me. We're going to Camp Penelly. We're going to be doing some stuff with the Marines." First time I'd had that opportunity in all those years. So one of the things that we were invited to do was do what's called a PME, a Professional Military Educational Seminar with an active duty military unit, and it just happened to be Suicide Charlie, 1st Lieutenant Marines. So in order to prepare for that, essentially 4 or 5 of us went, and we spent time with the young Marines. We had lots and lots of questions. We created a presentation and a white paper called Lessons Learned Operation Way City. We began to push that out into active duty units, and especially into the upper leadership. That resulted in people like Jim Mattis reading my book, General Conway, who was his superior officer and took the entire 1st Marine Expeditionary Force to Baghdad from Kuwait. Those gentlemen read it, they studied it, they said, we're not going to let this happen again. So as a result of that, the missions of Baghdad and later Fallujah 1 and Fallujah 2, very similar to what we faced in Way. Large cities, lots of people, lots of important mosques, holy shrines, things of that nature. And there was a great debate that came up over the operational plan and the rules of engagement. There was a side that argued, hey, we can't be blowing up shrines and mosques because those are important to the people, and yet they're enemy defensive positions. And so Jim Mattis basically listened to the debate for like 2 days, and then he said, okay, here's what we're going to do. He said, if anybody shoots at any of my Marines from a mosque or a holy shrine, that's an enemy defensive position. You take it out. If anybody gives you a crap, you tell them to come and see me. You all know who Jim Mattis is. He's the real deal. It also created a 501c nonprofit veterans organization. We call ourselves the 1-5 Vietnam Veterans. We get together every year at a reunion, but mostly we're there to support the active duty Marines. So when they're deployed, we send care packages and so forth. And we love to do these PMEs. Over the years, I've done maybe 50 of those with different military units. And they're the best experiences of my life. How are we doing on time, Tony? Got another 2 or 3 minutes? Okay. One of the really cool things that happened about 5 or 6 years ago is Marine Corps University. One of the things that distinguishes the Marine Corps from a lot of different military services around the world is their training is almost as hazardous as the combat that they're training to go deal with. They make it as realistic as possible. So they developed, the Marine Corps University developed what's called a decision forcing exercise for young Marine leaders, primarily lieutenants, just coming out of OCS, coming out of the basic school, coming out of the infantry officers course, but also NCOs, sergeants, and corporals who go through the Marine Corps Small Unit Leadership course. And what they do, they call the exercise Charlie 1, which was my call sign. They put him in a room by himself. The guy may have been already in training for 3 months and learned all about Marine Air Ground Task Force, bomb, blast, bird, how to use supporting arms, and so forth and so on. They sit him down and they give him my 5-paragraph order. You're Lieutenant Warr. You're a platoon commander. You have found yourself on the point. You're facing an enemy force. You're in a city. By the way, your job is to destroy the enemy, and you can't blow up any of the buildings. The initial reaction for these young Marines is disbelief. They say, no, that could not possibly happen. But then they say, well, not only could it happen, but it did happen. Here, read this book. So these are just, I'm going to go through this very rapidly, but our 1-5 Vietnam Veterans Association, you know, Marines love our history. Our history is extremely important to us. Besides what's important on my left and my right, which is my Marines, my buddy, there's this complete feeling that I can't let Marine Corps history down. So we remember and we honor. And one of the ways we do that is by creating memorial monuments. One of those that we helped build was the Sergeant Rodney Davis Memorial Monument. He's a Medal of Honor recipient in Macon, Georgia. And we recently dedicated the 5th Marines Vietnam War Memorial Monument at Camp Pendleton. And I'll show you a couple of pictures here and there. And from the Monument Project, we also created and funded the Sergeant Davis Scholarship Program, which is now fully funded and will be in perpetuity. And we have 4 students going through school at a $2,000 per student stipend, okay? If we don't raise another dime, that will be there making until the end of our lives. Under development, I'm working on a documentary film. I call it Return to Phase Line Green. It's basically, its focus is to listen to the voices of those who served in combat during the Vietnam War. Right now, I'm constricting it to Way City veterans, mainly because this is known as a very historic battle, and maybe the voices will be heard. But essentially, it's there because over the last 50 years, I've read every single book I can get my hands on. I watch all the documentary films, and it just seems, in particular of late, that my generation of veterans, Vietnam veterans, are portrayed in a way that I don't recognize. You see these films, you see veterans, and I love them all, and they have every right to say whatever they want, because the truth is, folks, war sucks. Not much glory in there, but the whole idea of a veteran feeling ashamed for his service because of the outcome, because of the controversy, because of the anti-war movement, is just beyond me. So my focus is, I want to capture on film these men's stories. Who were you? What did you do? Tell us about your service. And I have only one question, and it is, after all this time, how do you feel about your service? And so far, knock on wood, every one of these guys has said, I'm proud of my service. I would do it again. So that's what that's about. I'm also continuing to work on my 3rd book, which will be the sequel of Phase Line Green. It covers the next 2.5 years of our combat history. I'm also a member of an organization called Vietnam Veterans for Factual History. If you're at all interested in factual history about the Vietnam War, this is a tremendous library of books and articles and films that we consider to be accurate. We have never asked anybody for any kind of a favorable review of what happened. We simply want it to be factual. So this is a gathering place for books that are factual. This is the Rodney Davis Memorial. There's a big long story, and I won't go into it here. And this is the new 5th Marines Vietnam War Memorial on Camp San Mateo, which is the headquarters of the Fighting Fifth. Now we're at the questions. Yes, Larry?
You mentioned the word balance and early on. Can you tell us a little what you're referring to when you say balance?
Yeah, absolutely. The Marine Corps, after I got out, 9 years later, developed a set of leadership principles and traits. Traits and principles. The traits are how a young Marine leader should act. Okay. The principles are very important things to remember about you are going into combat. Okay. Principle number 11 says, deploy your unit in accordance with its capabilities. In other words, you should know what your guys can do and what they can't do under a certain set of circumstances. And I will tell you that when I received my R5 paragraph order saying attack and destroy the enemy and don't blow up the buildings, I went, you gotta be kidding me. Okay, this is completely foreign to me, but I'm an officer, I can't complain. Okay. Then I had to pass that down to my NCOs. Let me tell you something. They are not quiet. They basically...
That's right. Sergeants ain't gonna take it.
That's right. So I basically, the whole point of that, Larry, is nobody in the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War or any time ever wants to go into a city and simply rebelize it and then sort out the good guys from the bad guys. They wouldn't do it if I told them to do it. What it means is, like Fallujah 1 and Fallujah 2, you're going to have casualties. There are going to be civilians who get killed. But you are going to do this as rapidly as possible. You're going to do it as professionally as possible. You're going to minimize casualties on both sides of the equation, but you're going to get the job done. In both Fallujah 1 and Fallujah 2, there's a city of 500,000 people in the heart of Iraq. Fallujah 1 ended artificially because there were a lot of complaints about the carnage and the death. And there was a big to-do between General Mattis and the government. And he was basically forced to stop. 2/3 of the way into it, it's almost done, stop. 7 months later, Fallujah was the worst city in Iraq because from all over the Middle East, these fighters were sucked into that battle. So the military gave, this is now the 1st Marine Division again, but under a different general, Tonsky. They had to do it all over again. But it was exactly the same plan. The plan was secure the battle space, find the heads of the snakes, take them out, use overwhelming arms, use combined arms, and then move the Marines in such a way that they can do their job with a pretty good chance of success. Did I answer your question? What else? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, full confession. I spent the Battle of Cat in my 2nd year of law school in Ithaca, New York. And so I'm not going to offer to you what we considered was going on during the Battle of Tet, but the veterans who had already returned were of a view that this was a complete screw-up, this whole war. But you served, and you said I've reflected over the past 50 years.
Yes.
Right? Reflect for us, if you would.
Okay, well, Tet was a microcosm of the entire war. The entire war, it was repetitive, and it was situational and conditional. And it depended upon strong leadership. In my heart, I believe that the Vietnam War was an honorable undertaking. People don't see that these days because you have the benefit of hindsight. And some have debunked the whole domino theory that was gospel in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, post-World War II, post-Korea, post-French Indochina War. If we let this fall into communism, war will fall into communism. So you have to kind of put yourself into that state of mind. If you think about it today and you look back on it, you go, yeah, we probably shouldn't see that. I have complaints about the fact that our leadership, and this is still true today, when we get confronted by something like this, we don't stop and research and really look into where we're going and who we're dealing with. We did not do that in Vietnam. I truly believe that it was honorable because of that belief, that belief in our country that if we don't stop communism here, then we're going to have to stop them somewhere else eventually. And eventually it's going to arrive on our shores. Now we're fighting in our own country. That's a really good question, sir. Make me think.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
This is very political.
Okay.
Would you say, I'm going to use the word enemy in a very broad sense. But can we correlate the city of Hue to our southern border if you think about it?
Sorry. Well, certainly the southern border is important, so is the northern border. It seems like the threat's coming from the
Well,
south.
where the threat
the north.
is,
Yeah.
where the threat is currently.
Right. Yeah.
I see a correlation
Right.
in tactics. It may be civilian,
Right.
but a tactic.
Well, I'm gonna go back to this gentleman's question and finish answering it because I think it's important, and then I'll try to, I try not to be political, guys, okay, I really
Yeah,
do.
I understand.
Oh, great. But I said it was an honorable undertaking, but it was screwed up from the beginning.
Yeah.
Historical fact. Here's the scenario. This is in very early 1965. We've barely deployed any troops. There was a meeting requested by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to meet with President Johnson and Robert Strange McNamara, our Defense Secretary. What a name, really big. I don't have a lot of respect for either of those two gentlemen. And they basically, they made a pitch. Okay, you want to get us involved in Vietnam. I'm assuming you want us to succeed there, which means we have to destroy the enemy forces, the North Vietnamese, who have attacked us across the border into the south. And you want us to do this successfully, then what we're going to recommend is, any of you know anything about Operation Desert Storm? Desert Storm, in my opinion, the finest combat operation ever conducted by our nation. Okay, I'll go into the details of that, but this is all factually based because out of a kind of a chance thing, the Commandant of the Marine Corps' aide at the camp was a Marine Lieutenant Colonel by the name of Charles Cooper. And they organized this briefing in the White House, and the Joint Chiefs have developed lots of flip charts. They're going to have these flip charts, okay? But nobody bothered to have the flip chart stand. And it's like, oh, we're all here, there's no flip chart stand, but we have flip charts. So they grabbed Cooper, who would normally not be in the Oval Office at this meeting, and said, come in here, stand right there, keep your ears closed and your mouth closed, and hold the flip chart. Okay. And so he was a witness to it. And when he published his memoir, he retired as a 3-star general. He tells that story. The Joint Chiefs of Staff told Johnson and McNamara that if you want to do this right, if you want to be successful, here's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to marshal your forces, which means 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 boots on the ground in South Vietnam. You get that all ramped up. You have to secure the space. It's the big country, which means you can't let anybody come south across the DMZ. You can't let anybody go on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and bring in supporting arms and bring in food and troops and so forth and so on. And then what you have to do is shock and awe on all of the major enemy command posts. That's what they proposed. Yeah, that's okay. Johnson and McNamara booed in the White House with a chorus of F-bombs. Johnson was saying, you're trying to get me into World War III, China's right across the border. And from that point on, everything was McNamara's war. I think McNamara was a very dishonorable person because he actually, this is documented, that he was well aware of the circumstances on the ground when he took his famous trip over there. I think it was in '67, fact-finding trip. Comes back, makes the report. He had written the report before he ever left the U.S. That's factual history. So, did I answer your question fully? So yeah, I think it was an honorable undertaking, but let me tell you something. All of my guys have bitches, gripes, and complaints about stuff that happened over there. That's the reality of war. And until you eliminate war, you're not going to eliminate civilian casualties and that sort of thing. So Did I answer your question there?
Because you,
I know what your sergeant said when he came out there, when he told them not to use, they blow up the building, to probably, I know what they said.
Yeah, I did too.
Are you out of your effing mind?
Yeah.
Did the South Vietnamese army really fight for the country? You hear all these stories about they didn't fight, the corruption and all this in the South Vietnamese
Let me
army.
give you a little, another new factoid. You all know Uncle Walter Cronkite, right? And you all probably heard his announcement after his visit during TET, which was broadcast on February 29th. We have found footage of him on February 14th, still in Saigon, talking about the Tet Offensive and the Battle for Hue. It's a completely different story. And one of the elements he said was the army stood and fought. These local civilians did not rise up. And it was a clear victory for our allies in the United States. I'm sorry, Tom.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And you have a certificate.
Oh, okay.
Can I make one comment?
Sure.
Just real briefly, I just finished the second book. I've read both books. They're edge-of-the-seat books. If you have things to do, don't start reading because you're not going to want to put it down. Either book, they're factual, they're amazing. If you get a chance. That baseline green was amazing. The second book was very, very informative. You felt like you were right there, and they're very personable. You read about the fears, the tears, and the glory, every piece of what those guys went through. So if you get a chance, read those books.
I'd like to again thank you for your coming here to talk to us. And it was a great talk. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you, guys.